I fly left center field, and Miguel Sano says that's enough.
You really can't take that argument that there's not sufficient evidence unless you define precisely what evidence actually is. All right. We don't control the tides. We can't make it rain or make rain stop. We don't begin or end a day. We're not in charge of sunrise or sunset. All these people who are talking about global warming, what they're saying basically is that things are happening within the weather that are beyond our control. So somewhere there's got to be something or some being that is in control. There's got to be something that's keeping the planets in alignment. There's got to be something that makes night and day. There's got to be some power greater than us that is somehow in control of things. The fact that the solar system works the way it does and that magnetic fields aren't causing planets to collide. The question, of course, is to find what evidence is. If evidence has to be that you see something, I mean, if I have a bottle of water here and it's moved over to there, something moved it.
Yeah.
Now, you may not have seen what moved it, but something moved it. And if you're going to say that evidence is only evidence if you actually see the mover doing the moving, well, that's going to be a limited understanding of evidence.
Yeah.
Or it's going to be only evidence when you can identify who the mover is. We see flowers grow. We don't make that happen.
Okay.
We might know what has to be done to nurture it, about watering a garden, putting in vitamins, putting in special minerals and everything like that. But we can't make a seed become a flower.
Okay.
Yes, somehow that is happening. So I mean, if we just look at nature, and that doesn't even account for what happens when you look within the human person. And when you look at what happens within a human person, as they grow, as they develop, as they become, a more adult being, a more thinking being, and they begin to get senses of emotions. Well, where does that come from? We don't create it, but it is.
Okay. That makes sense.
In the whole world of 12-step recovery, you have people who are alcoholics, drug addicts, and they're going to talk about the number of times they've tried to stop drinking or using drugs, and it never worked. But then all of a sudden, at some point, it does work. And the only thing that they could understand that's different is that there had to be a power greater than themselves that worked from outside on them and gave them the strength to do what they couldn't do on their own. It's not just a visual evidence. Sometimes it's an evidence that comes simply from logic. If this is happening, something had to make it happen. Even if we want to talk about evolution and, the development of man through evolution, somewhere you have to go all the way back to somehow all of this started. So what do you want to call the being that got the whole thing started? If there was this giant explosion or something that created planets and solar system, okay, well, what caused that explosion? Sometimes people are afraid I think, to assign things like that to God, because they're confusing the concept of God and the concept of religion.
Yeah.
And there's a big difference there. People can understandably have problems with one specific approach to that being. People can have problems with Christianity, with Catholicism, with Protestantism, with Judaism, with Jehovah's Witness, with Hinduism, with Islam. People can have problems with a particular approach. But that can't really take away the rational belief that there is something there. That somehow there is this being, this power. People are sometimes afraid to call it God because they feel that aligns them with one religion rather than another. And it's just not true.
Yeah.
So for people to say, unless we see it, I'm not going to believe it, it's absurd. Because there's so many things that happen that we don't see happening. When we're sleeping, somehow our hearts are still beating, our pulses are still going, our blood is still circulating, but we're not doing anything. What's keeping that going? We really can't say it's just the human mind, because even people that are non-compass mentors, even people that are technically brain dead, still have a lot of those functions going on. So there has to be something that's causing things that we just don't see. That makes sense?
It does, and it actually answered the first question I was going to ask you, so it definitely
Good.
definitely helps. I'm going to rephrase the second question, because what I wanted to ask you was, like, often, like in the world of law, like when it comes to being in a courtroom on trial, whatever it is, arguments aren't verified unless there's sufficient evidence that is almost seen by the eye. So I was gonna I guess I could still ask it the same way. Do you believe that this is different when it comes to something like an argument against with God? Like you just said, pretty much in what you did say, it doesn't always have to be something we can see. It's things happen when we're not paying attention. Do you think that's something that's strictly kind of related to God, or do you think that's something that could be attached to anything? Like evidence can be anything that even if we're not seeing it, it's still proven through enough context, enough things that happen, because obviously things happen in the world every day that can't be explained. I see it. I was in the hospital 2 weeks ago, and I was like, thank God that I'm still alive. And my first thought always is that's evidence of God, but that's somebody like me who's a firm believer in my religion. Do you think that it's different with God than everything else? Like most of the time in the world, it's innocent until proven guilty. And the only way you can be proven guilty or innocent is by firm, hard evidence. So when it comes to God, do you feel that's different?
It's got to be different, because we're not looking for firm, hard evidence, or we're not always going to find firm, hard evidence. Unless, again, we get right back to the same point of define what evidence actually is. Does it have to be seen? Does it have to be provable? No one in a court of law is declared innocent. They're declared not proven guilty. Which basically means we can't say specifically, you did this. But something still happened. So somebody did it.
Yeah.
So if it wasn't you, it was somebody else. Something still happened. And the problem when you try to put that into a concept of God is, it happened. So somebody did it. Something did it. Whether you could point specifically and say, this is the one who did it, you still know somebody did it. If there's a murder trial and there's one suspect, and that suspect is found not guilty, the murder still took place. So there's still someone who did it. So you know that that person is still there. So if you understand the fact that somebody being found guilty or not guilty doesn't change the fact that something happened and someone did it, well, fine. If something happened and a court of law can't prove the person who did it, it doesn't mean that thing didn't happen. Someone did it. They just can't pinpoint and name who it is. It's going to be the same thing in experiences of God.
That
If
makes
I'm going to see, God is responsible for the forces of nature. Can I prove that? No,
no.
no. But someone, somehow, these forces of nature are taking place. So I'm going to call the name God. Why not?
Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah, the whole point is, even in a court of law, if they can't say this one person in particular did it, okay, but it still happened. There's still a source of it. And that's where, in faith, we'd say this is where God comes in.
Yeah. So third question I had was, although there's often I feel like there's almost more evidence in today's world that God doesn't exist than that he does, hard evidence, with things such as COVID and the things that go on in our world that make it seem like, why is this happening? If all should be good. How do you, as a Catholic priest, continue to keep your faith and belief in God strong every single day?
There's one thing to say what God did and another thing to say what man did. You go right back to the first story in the Bible, the story of Adam and Eve. And, God creates this paradise, puts Adam and Eve into it, gives them everything they need to exist and be happy. Gives them one rule, only one, don't eat from that one tree. You've got all these other trees to eat from, you've got everything you need or want. So what's the first sin? They go to that one tree that they were told, don't touch. It's one, we can't blame God for what we've done. Because the reality is we have free will. And we can choose to close ourselves off to what God wants. I know right from wrong. That doesn't mean I've never done anything wrong. So when I'm choosing to be disobedient, I can't blame God. COVID, all the evidence that there is shows that this was somehow man-made and man-spread. People not wearing masks, people not cooperating, people, who are still refusing to follow the basic rules and regulations. You can't blame God for that. If I pick up a hammer and hit myself in the head with it, I can't complain that the hammer maker hurt me. So if we're not going to choose to do things the way God wants us to do, if we're going to choose to use our free will selfishly rather than lovingly, if we're going to choose to do things that we know might cause danger to ourselves or someone else, well, then we have to accept the responsibility for what we've done.
That makes sense.
I don't think the evidence that makes people think God doesn't exist means that God doesn't exist. I think that evidence, more often than not, points to the fact that either people are not taking God into consideration when they're making their decisions, or they're being specifically disobedient.
That makes sense. All right. Okay, so the last question I want to ask you, it's kind of every question's kind of been based around the same thing of the evidence, because that's what the whole writing was about, was the evidentialism. And one person who's Bergman believed you don't need evidence. Your beliefs are rational, whether you have it or not, whether you could see it or not. And he's kind of like going based on what you're saying, like, does evidence need to be seen? Which I believe it doesn't. And from what you said, it feels like you believe it doesn't either when it comes to something like this. And when it comes to things that happen in the world, like, you know, amazing things have happened, like miracles, you could say some things. And do you think proof of that, you know, things such as that nature, do you think that's sufficient enough as a Catholic believer to prove to other people of the existence of God? Like sometimes, like you said, there's some things that just can't be explained. There's things that you can't point out who did it, but somebody did it. Something happened. Do you think that's sufficient enough? And I don't know if in your experience as being a priest, have you been able to show somebody the existence of God and show, you know, almost convert somebody to a religion through showing them things like that, things that can't be explained, that there's only one thing you can point to at that point?
Oh, sure. I mean, certainly a lot in dealing with people who, you know, what are the drug addicts or alcoholics? You see that with people every day, where they come to realize that somehow the power of God is touching their lives in ways that they can't understand, or in ways that they couldn't understand before. But they're realizing that something happened for them or to them that they could not control, that they did not control. And it was something that happened to them for the better. The birth of a baby. You know, sometimes when a person is sick and they get well, or even sometimes when people are being dealt a lot of bad news and they just find comfort, you know, in knowing that the bad news is going to pass. You know, it's when we're not expecting to see the person doing for us what they're doing that we can attribute it to God. When we feel that we have to see, it's not enough for me to say, you know, somehow my life has gotten better, or somehow I just witnessed something spectacular and it gave me a feeling inside that was incredible. You know, I watched this sunrise in Hawaii or something, and it was so spectacularly beautiful that it made me very emotional. But we don't see the person who's making that sunrise.
Yeah.
We call it God. You know, and I think we have that all the time. You know, I think those moments are around us if we're willing to be open to it. If we want to close our minds to it and just say, no, I want a scientific explanation to everything, then we'd have to go all the way back to the beginning and say, okay, where did it all start?
Yeah.
So yes, as a Catholic priest, I see people all the time who become more and more aware that there is a power greater than themselves that's somehow working in their lives. And that they're happier when they give into that power.
Yeah. Perfect. All right, yeah.
We'll go back to the idea of, you know what? If this goes from here to here, whether you saw me move it or not, you know it was moved.
Yeah.
Now, when you have something really spectacular that's happening, are you willing to say that, yeah, there is this all-encompassing being that was the mover?
Yeah.
For keeping the planets in line, for keeping the earth in its rotation, for keeping us alive at night, for making the sunrise. You know, we see the evidence, but we have to just be, but the leap of faith is to say, okay, this evidence makes me say that God did it. That's the leap of faith.
Yeah. that definitely makes a lot of sense. That was my last question. I want to thank you for doing this interview. Definitely helped me out a lot, and I've known you forever, so it was much easier to do it with you than anybody else.
Oh, I'm glad you worked it out. I'm glad you arranged it.